Hello, and welcome to another episode of Tales of a Death Doula. I'm Martha, and I am a certified death doula, and this podcast is intended to educate, inspire, and bring a little hope around topics of death and dying. Throughout human history, humans have been fascinated with death and what it means to die, and what it means to inform life by studying death. As a student of theology and the dying process and all of the cultural significance around death and dying and how we bury our dead throughout history and throughout different cultural aspects of this study, I've learned so much about the hope and renewal that death can bring when you understand and become a student of death. In today's episode, we'll be discussing this descent into the underworld. We'll be walking with Inanna into the underworld and looking at this very ancient myth of Inanna's descent. And then I'll talk a little bit about my own descent into the heart of darkness in my own life, and how that has resulted in an ultimate renewal and rebirth in my own life. So let's discuss Inanna. I'm going to read from a blog by Denise Gobelar. Hope I'm saying her name right. She is a psychologist and psychotherapist who has a lovely blog on the descent of Inanna, the ancient Mesopotamian goddess. And she writes so beautifully, I might as well just read it. We'll include the link to her blog post in the comments below. So let's read a little bit about the descent of Inanna. The descent of Inanna is one of the oldest myths of journeying to the underworld, where through death an initiation takes place and ultimately a rebirth. Inanna was an ancient Mesopotamian goddess of love, beauty, sex, war, justice, and political power. She was originally worshipped in Sumer and later in Babylon as Ishtar. Inanna, or Ishtar, was the queen of heaven and earth. Inanna's possession of the divine powers of Meh, which encompasses all aspects of human civilization, made her very powerful. This myth of Inanna's descent concerns the meeting of the Queen of Heaven, Inanna, with the Queen of the Underworld, Inanna's sister, the dark goddess Ereshkigal. I can't say that name right. Individually, the sisters symbolize the goddess's dual aspects, and jointly, they represent the primordial polarity and full spectrum of the feminine. The underworld is symbolic of the unconscious. This can be seen as a story about an encounter with one's shadow, necessary in the growth towards wholeness and consciousness. Jung's journey of individualization involves an integration of the conscious, upper world aspects with the unconscious, shadowy underworld aspects. Being from the great above, Inanna's has only partial awareness, and until her ear opens to the great below, her understanding is necessarily limited. Volkstein in 1983 wrote that those who return from the great below carry within them the knowledge of rebirth and often return, bringing to their culture a new world view. However, this is a perilous journey. Inanna was a queen in the underworld. Instead of being treated as such, she was stripped of her royal garments and jewels, her outward symbols of power, beauty, and success. Suffering, humiliation, and loss are the only powers able to affect the ego's belief in its invincibility. Stripped of her persona and naked, Inanna is confronted by her shadow, the dark goddess, and is turned into a corpse, a piece of rotting meat hanging on a hook. Sounds like a familiar feeling. So as we initiate our descent into the underworld, I intend to bring you my uninhibited and vulnerable story of my own descent into the heart of darkness of my own underworld. Let's wade together through these dark waters and see how I came out on the other side. Back in 2012, actually this is 2018. I'm sorry, what am I talking about? 2008. What year is it? Where am I? Who am I? What's going on? In 2008, I made an epic decision to move back to San Diego and marry my long-time on-again, off-again boyfriend. This decision was a long time coming. We had a very tumultuous relationship, and we're breaking up and getting back together and breaking up and getting back together quite often. And for some reason, we both decided that getting married would fix all of our problems. We all know how the story ends. And before I moved back to San Diego, my spirit guides were already working with me to warn me about how dangerous some idea this was. Tom was a very unstable man with many demons and many problems. And I thought I could fix him. I thought I was stronger than him and I could save him. And I remember being very much interested in watching the movie The Cell. Do you remember this movie, The Cell, with Jennifer Lopez and Vince Vaughn? And they are delving into the psyche of a serial killer who is unconscious and has locked a lady into a dungeon area, and they can't find her, and they go into his subconscious. And Jennifer Lopez eventually entraps his inner child and the wounds of his inner child that have caused him to become this demon monster serial killer. And it's a very perilous journey. For some reason, my spirit guides kind of nudged me to watch that movie before I moved home with Tom. I should have known that was a bad idea, right? But I did. And things were very tumultuous as we were planning our wedding. He tried to kill me twice. And I still married him because I thought I was going to save him. And it was a very scary time in my life and a very dark journey into his psyche, trying to understand the root of all of his pain and trying to save him. Who did I think I was? Jesus Christ? I don't know what I was thinking, but I thought I could save him. And things only got worse after we finally got married. And as people know, if you're in an abusive relationship, things often take a turn after there is a marriage, and the abuser thinks that they now own and control the person that they are abusing. And things got very dangerous. And I remember being in the situation of chaos. I had not washed a pan correctly, and I was throwing him into a outrage about my ruining everything and not being able to keep house and all of the crazy that ensues when you have somebody who is emotionally unstable. And he tried to choke me and threw me up against a wall. And at that moment, I got my power back. I knew that this was not going to end well, and I knew that it was now or never. And I prayed for the Holy Spirit to come and help me, give me my strength. And at that moment, I felt the diamond white light of the Holy Spirit come through my crown chakra into me, and I was very calm. And I just looked at him and I said, "Are you done? Take your hands off me, put me down. I'm leaving." I got my purse, I got in the car, I called my therapist for an emergency therapy session, went to her office and breathed into a paper bag, having a full panic attack, realizing that it was time to go, and this was going to be very dangerous if I stayed. It's very hard for me to make that decision, though, because I knew that if I left him, I would be leaving him to his fate, and he had a death wish, not only for me, but for himself. And I knew that I was leaving him to die. And it was very hard for me to make that decision. That's why I stayed. That's why I got married. That's why I stuck it out. I thought that I could save him. Realizing that I couldn't was traumatic. But I made it that afternoon in my therapist's office. And I called him on the way back home and I said, "I need you to be very calm. I'm packing a bag. I'm going to go stay with my parents." And I got home and he was calm. And I just remember, because I was calm, I had prayed to the Holy Spirit and I had calmed down myself and was just, now I was very rational and reasonable. And we went outside and talked on the back porch, and I sat him down and I said, "I have tried to love you and I have tried to save you. And I love me more than I love you, and I've got to save myself because I'm drowning here." And I remember having a visual image of a lifeguard. When I was in college, I had gotten my lifeguard certification and took a PE class as a lifeguard and worked as a lifeguard one summer. And when you're studying to become a lifeguard, they teach you how to kick somebody off, because when you're trying to save somebody who's drowning, quite often the drowning person will grab and hold and try to grab hold of the person who's trying to save them and take them under with them. And they teach you, literally, kick them off. Let them sink. You've got to get up and get some air yourself before you can come down and grab them and put them in a chokehold and swim to safety. And I remember thinking about that as I was talking with Tom, telling him, "I'm drowning. I have to save myself." And I was kicking him off. And it was one of the hardest things that I've ever had to do. But I did. And he understood. He even respected me for making this decision and said, "You should save yourself. This is right to put yourself first. This is correct." And he even said, "You've given me more love than my mother even gave me. You've tried everything. I know this isn't going to work." I think he was relieved. Knowing that he wasn't going to end up killing me. He even drove me to the airport, and we hugged goodbye at the airport, and that was the last I ever saw of him. And it was a very, very, very dark time, and I know now that I escaped with my life in that situation. And after the years of dealing with his death, 2 years after we divorced, he wound up dying. And getting that call and dealing with the emotional turmoil of reconciling with his finality of his death. After a couple of years later, dealing with my own parents and their deaths, leaving a career in San Diego and moving back to Dallas to help my parents prepare and get their arrangements made, and dealing with both of my parents dying in my arms. My mother had a sudden heart attack and died in my arms, and then later my father dealt with Alzheimer's and dementia. And it was a slow walk home for my father and I, and he ended up dying in my arms as well. And having those experiences with journeying into the underworld of another person's psyche, of my psyche, why I would go and do that, and years of therapy, and coming out on the other side in this very intense study of death and dying, of what it means to help somebody in that dying process, of what it means to save yourself, of what it means to choose to live. Life is for the living. Don't die with your dead. There's wonderful lessons in how to live fully when you can face and confront the death of another. In The Descent of Inanna, it is a story of her venturing into the underworld, facing her sister, the goddess of darkness, and being humiliated and disrobed at every gate. They put her through 7 gates on her way into the underworld, and she has to disrobe and take off her talisman and take off her ornaments of protection, and she ventures in naked and unafraid and vulnerable, and there to face what is there at the bottom of the barrel. And it reminds me so much of, after all of my interactions with my ex-husband, I had this very strong visual as we were separating and I was trying to get back into the land of the living, of how he was digging himself a grave. And it's just a visual of me standing on a grassy knoll, and then this big, deep grave hole that Tom was digging for himself. And I had tried to lasso him and was trying to pull him up out of that deep, dark hole and show him that this is life and that there's so much beauty and the grass is green up here, and come up with me in the land of the living. And I was trying to force him. The closer I got him up to the light, and we had so many good days. It wasn't all bad, of course not. It was so many good days where I convinced him to come and live with me in the land of the living. But the closer I got him to that light, the more he resented me, and the more he fought, and the more he wanted to drop back down into that underworld of his own psyche. And eventually, he yanked me back down there with him and tried to stomp me into that ground and bury me there. And I chose to live. And I chose to climb out of that deep hole by my fingernails, climbing out of that grave, arriving back in the land of the living, naked, bloodied, bruised, but unafraid. So, as we think about the rebirth aspect of this story, Inanna has a lot of things to say about the rebirth. She ends up coming back from the pits of hell that her sisters hung her on a hook and left for dead, and Inanna's ancient safeguard, who she had told that if she didn't come back to send help, and they come and they save her and they negotiate for her return. And the Queen of Darkness says that she can leave, but she has to find a replacement. And her return is not quite as easy as her descent. Her return to life, having to find a replacement for her, and eventually she chooses to send her own husband, which I find hilarious, down to replace her, and that's how the seasons change story, very much like Persephone. But it's a story of delving into the depths. I am an English major by trade. I love literature, and I love the story of the Heart of Darkness, and I've reread it recently. And of course, the movie based on that novel, The Apocalypse Now, one of my favorites. Deep struggle of going into the darkness, facing your fears, facing the darkness, and coming out on the other side. And the renewal that you bring to life when you understand more about death and you face those fears. You are now a very powerful individual who understands and knows things about the fears. And this is kind of my mission in this podcast, is to help unveil the mystery of death and dying, so that we can all learn these lessons and all become a little more powerful in our own unfolding. As my own personal story attests, we all go through these changes, these transitions. Death is just the ultimate transition of life to death. But we go through transitions, a little death, a little death, a little death, all throughout our lives. You might get divorced. You might change a job. You might move. There are transitions of old you and a rebirth of new you throughout our life process. There is for every ending a new beginning. And these transitions are a little death. And the more we can understand and learn the lessons and grow from those experiences, we become more and more knowledgeable about how to live a good life, how to live an empowered life, how to live fully in this experience, not afraid, but aware. I hope that you have enjoyed my storytelling style. The whole purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories that we are afraid to look at and that we are afraid to listen to, and that our culture in America has swept under the rug. Nobody wants to talk about death and dying. And there's so much rich history to learn from. So thank you for joining me on my trek to the underworld today. And I appreciate your time. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and like the podcast. And we'll be coming with new episodes in the days and weeks to come. continuing our discussions on death and dying, near-death experiences, spirituality, mysticism, metaphysics, all the good stuff around death and how it can inform a better life. Thank you. Have a blessed day.